Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to do 401 and 506, I think. We've got maybe half an hour to an hour potentially to do these, but obviously with them, all of these, it'd be good if we can get through them and concentrate only on those matters that we really feel need to change. Laura, I think you're going to lead us through each of these. Sebastian?
And I just want to give a couple of introductory remarks that pertain to both SRS 401 and SRS 506. So they're already labeled as priorities for future review. And the reason for that is the extensive commentary that we have received from GSB members over the last weeks. A couple of fundamental issues have been identified for these two standards. And what we will try to do in the coming 30 minutes to 1 hour is to provide an overview of the feedback received, and Laura will go through this, and address a couple of what we consider minor but important questions at this stage for the GSSB. The suggestion of the standard division is, however, to reconfirm as part of the discussions now that these two standards will have to be put up for priority review post-launch of the GRI standards. And we are also making a proposal to that extent in the work plan that we're going to put forward for discussion. Having said all this, what I would caution against at this stage is trying to fix in these standards the matters beyond what the standards division has identified as actually possible at this point in time. And also, given that we will come very quickly back to discussing terms of reference for working groups or technical committees addressing these two standards, the inventorization of shortcomings of these two standards to limit this at this point in time, because we might venture into discussions that are difficult to contain within the time boundaries that we have for today. So with this commentary, I'll ask Laura to present the developments related to these two standards over the last 4 weeks.
Yep. Thank you, Bastian. So for SRS 401 on economic performance, as Bastian said, we have received numerous comments from GSSB members during the preliminary review of this standard. I'm not going to explain each of the comments that we have received since they are fairly extensive, but they range from reviewing the title of the standard to reassessing the value of some of the disclosures for sustainability reporting, to clarifying the scope and content of some of the individual disclosures. There's a number of GSSB comments that we have been able to address whenever they were straightforward for us to implement in-house. But the bulk of the comments we feel are better addressed as part of a thorough content review process in the future. And that's why, as Bastian mentioned, we are proposing to hold off on any major content review for now, but to prioritize this standard for review after the transition to standards. However, I will explain some of the clarifications that we've made in the 2nd of May versions for disclosure 4011 on economic value generated and distributed. We got lots of content-related comments, mainly dealing with the G4 guidance for this disclosure. And due to the extensive comments we've received, we have decided not to assess the G4 guidance on a case-by-case basis on whether the content should be transitioned as a requirement, recommendation, or guidance. And what we're proposing is that we transition the bulk of the content as guidance with no modifications, but we have noted all of the content-related comments and we have logged them for future review. There's one element of guidance from G4 for this disclosure that we have elevated into a reporting requirement following GSSB feedback, and that is clause 2.2, which is asking organizations to use the data from audited financial statements for compiling this disclosure. So this is the approach that we have taken for this disclosure. And the second disclosure for which we got substantive comments is disclosure 401.3 on defined benefit plans. There were some inconsistencies in the indicator as we had it in the G4 guidelines. The scope of the disclosure was not clear as to whether it only covered defined benefit plans or whether it covered other kinds of retirement plans. So we have attempted to clarify that in the 2nd of May version, but we've got some comments just before the session now, so we will take some time later to have a look at this disclosure in more detail. In terms of other comments received, there was one minor comment from one GSSB member to clarify the formulation in clause 2.2, where we currently say shall where possible. So we are going to clarify that, and we're going to use shall if applicable, which is more consistent with other indicators of similar nature. This is the only minor comment we've received ahead of the meeting, but as I just mentioned, we've got some comments just now on disclosure 401.3 on defined benefit plans. So if I could have that on the screen and walk the GSSB through the changes that we have made, and then take some comments on those changes.
Just while it's coming up on the screen, perhaps we can just address that 2.2. The change from where possible to if applicable.
It's in the same version. We've made it here.
Oh, have you? Okay. Does that seem reasonable to people from what they're reading in front of them? Yeah.
Different from what they have.
What you've got in line 140 of the printed version, in the middle of that line it says where possible. If we change that to if applicable. Is that correct?
Shall, if applicable.
Yeah. Any objections, any comments on that? Is that Judy?
Just a quick question. I didn't actually understand from the presentation that it was a changing where possible to if applicable. I've understood it to be adding the words if applicable into this instruction. So it has to be both applicable and possible, if you know what I mean, if that makes any sense. If I misunderstood that and it is a swap, then okay, but it just changes my calculation slightly.
Kirsten?
If it says shall, where possible, it's a very strict requirement, because then you go deep down to the reporting procedures for the organization. So it was my comment that it should either be shall, should where possible, or shall where relevant, or where applicable, if applicable, as it ended up with. This is, from my perspective, a reporting technicality, and it seems very unfortunate to make such a specific requirement, shall where possible, because that is what is possible. It's probably possible, but it can take lots of resources doing it.
Mm-hmm. So Judy, you're not overly concerned if it were to change to if applicable? No, okay. So shall we just go with that? Thank you. Okay, and then to the disclosure 4.3 or 401.3. Chelsea.
Sure. So on this one, following feedback from GSSB reviewers, the concern was that in G4, the section was titled Defined Benefit Plan
obligations. And it was not clear whether these disclosure elements relate only to defined benefit plans or to other types of retirement or pension benefits as well. What we're suggesting, because there are, and not being an expert at all in this area, but having listened to some of you who are, what we're suggesting is that for the temporary bridge with this standard, that we leave this relatively ambiguous as it stands, noting that this is prioritized for review. So compared to the draft that you're looking at now, we've gone back and reverted to the plan throughout this disclosure rather than bringing in defined benefit plan through these sub-elements. We've also broadened the title slightly to include and other retirement plans. And I would defer to a comment made by Michael Nugent that there has definitely been since G4 an increase in types of other plans aside from defined benefit plans, which probably need to be acknowledged.
I just think, I know, I'm quite confident that D&E should be broader than defined benefit plans. So if you've got an accumulation or a defined contribution plan, that certainly D&E should apply. I guess my question would be whether A, B and C should be restricted to defined benefits, and I can't see much benefit in doing that, restricting them. If it doesn't work for accumulation plans, then it doesn't work, but I think it's better to leave it broad and potentially a little ambiguous, bearing in mind what Bastian said at the beginning, that this is something that's going to be up for review. So any thoughts on that? I've been encouraged to say no, any thoughts, but any objections? Daniel Ingram, can I ask you to comment specifically? I know you're studying it there quite studiously and you're probably well informed on this particular point.
No objections to your updates, but yeah, I think it probably does need review, so I think that's all seems quite sensible for now.
Okay, thank you. Any other objections? Okay, so can we say that 401, do we have the questions up there? Yeah. So, does the GSSB, given the extent of questions and issues raised, complexity of addressing them as part of this transition, does the... Oh, Robin.
I'm sorry, was a decision made concerning the direct economic value generated?
What sort of decision are you specifically...
I have a question there. I don't think that the way that aggregate is being presented does apply straightforwardly for the financial sector at all. Because for the financial sector, there's the major issue of the provisions for risks, which is not being dealt with. But there again, I mean, it was neither dealt with the sector supplement years ago. So this hasn't changed, but I would just want to raise that point.
So your point is disclosure, it's the 4 point...
I suppose it's not taken into account, because I don't see where the provisions are being taken care of in the current definition.
You're saying that you think the provisions should be specifically mentioned in disclosure 401.1, that you should back out the provisions if you're in a financial institution?
When you say back out, you mean?
Adjust for.
Yes, or, well, there's a major issue in the way you take into account the provisions for risk in the financial sector. It can, whether you consider it as a deferred profit or a cost, it can change radically the aggregate.
What lines?
Well, it's not there, I guess, is the point that he's making, so it's not a line to be pointed to. Is it, Robin, is it in A, direct economic value generated and distributed on an accrual basis, including the following basic components? So the way it's worded doesn't preclude you from adjusting further if it's needed, for example, as may be needed in a financial institution. Is that adequate for the time being?
I'm sorry, where?
Line 138, so disclosure 401.1.
138, okay, yes.
Yeah. Then A,
Yes.
Right, so the leading words, direct economic value generated and distributed on an accruals basis, including the following basic components. So it's not definitive saying that you can't have more, it's simply saying you can't have fewer. So if you have more for a financial institution, to the extent I understand your point, is this right? That you could still do it? Is that?
Well, yes, but but then again, I mean, I think that as a bank, you would be a bit puzzled in the way you take that into account. I understand that the word including doesn't mean it's the only items you have to take into account. There can be others, but it's true that the P&L of a bank is slightly different than a P&L of a industrial company or service company.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, I guess my take, and I'll look to the rest of the room, but my take would be we're simply not in a position to give bank-specific guidance at this point on this standard. So my inclination would be to go with what we have and take it on board for the next iteration. Any other view? Any objections to that? No? Okay. All right, that being the case, does the GSSB agree with holding off on major content revisions for now, but prioritising this standard for future review? Yes, I'm seeing nods. Okay. What specific modifications does the GSSB agree for this draft standard? I'm not sure that I understand that. Do you mean the ones that we went through?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that would be agreeing to the change in 2.2, shall if applicable, and agreeing as well to the changes in disclosure 4013 to revert back to plan as a more generic term.
Okay. People happy? Okay. And is the GSSB comfortable enough to approve, comfortable enough, I like that, to approve the public exposure draft of this standard? Super. Okay, I'm going to take over from Eric and we're going to finish this. Okay, thank you. Shall we go on to the next? Chelsea? Laura?
Okay, thank you. So the next is SRS 506 on effluents and waste, and there's a similar situation for this one. But for this one, we do have a specific question for the GSSB to discuss now. So similar situation, we got numerous of content-related comments from the GSSB during the preliminary review of this standard. Not going to go through the detail of the individual comments we've got, but issues range from revisiting the scope of the standard to clarifying the scope and content of the individual disclosures. There's a number of GSSB comments we have taken on board when they were easy for us to implement in-house without the need of a thorough process. But however, the bulk of the comments we are proposing to park for a later review of the standard. In terms of the clarifications that we have been able to implement on the 2nd of May version, for disclosure 5062 on waste by type and disposal method, we have clarified that 2 separate figures are requested for hazardous and non-hazardous waste, and that is in line 157. So here we have a split requirement A into 2, one dealing with hazardous waste and the second one dealing with non-hazardous waste. And we have received no objections from the GSSB ahead of the meeting. The next, for disclosure 5064 on the transport of hazardous waste, there were multiple comments on the G4 guidance for this disclosure, and similar to the approach we've taken for the economic performance indicator 4011, we have decided or proposed to transition all of the guidance as guidance with no modifications, but we have taken note of all of the content-related comments you've made so that they can be addressed in a future review. And you can see how that has been transitioned in lines 181 till 208. Again, no objections from the GSSB received on the approach ahead of the meeting. But we do have one question for the GSSB now, and that has to do with disclosure 5065, starting in line 209. This is again an example where there's some inconsistencies between the title of the section and the actual disclosures. So here, as you read in the title, the section is looking at water bodies affected by water discharges and runoff. However, runoff is not covered in the disclosure. So the standard deviation proposal would be to align the two and to include runoff in requirement A. However, as this could be seen as potentially changing the scope of the requirement, we wanted to seek the views from the GSSB now.
Okay, thanks, Lara. So similar to the previous one, this is due for a big shake-up. Okay, so should we start with this one here then? Runoff, okay. Anyone has a suggestion? Daniel?
Yeah, I would just change the title by eliminating the last half of it and just leave it at water bodies affected. It's basically asking you to identify what the actually gets into species as well, so maybe it just needs a whole new title.
So, I mean, the issue, as I understand it, is it's either water bodies affected by discharges and runoff, or just water bodies affected by discharges, because runoffs are mentioned in the heading but not in the requirements. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the question would be, do you leave it as an inconsistency? Do you take runoff out of the title, or do you add runoff into the requirements? Yeah, or into the, yeah. Okay. Robin, you've... No. Okay. So, what's the Secretariat's preference on this?
Well, our recommendation would be to include runoff in the disclosure requirements. However, we don't have in-depth knowledge in this area, but since it is covered in the title of the section, we thought that that was the original intention of the working group who developed this disclosure.
How often would you have to put in the words "and runoff"? I mean, is it endemic, or is it just once or twice?
Just in A, as we have written on the bottom of the slide.
Judy?
I think I'd be comfortable adding runoff into the disclosure. I do think that you may need to add runoff into line 218 as well, outside of the shall statements, just to clarify that we're also talking about it in the recommendations as well. I think for those companies whose operations, are materially affected by runoff, I think it's just useful to clarify that we do have standards in this direction, and that they are usable as they are, but they just need a word tweak in order to make them so.
Would it be, is it in any way onerous and an imposition to increase this, as it were, to runoff for reporters? Would it be onerous or difficult for reporters if this were to include runoff? No. Okay, Daniel?
Yeah, no, I think in most of the cases where it says discharge, it should say discharge and runoff, or runoff, discharge or runoff. they apply. I don't find a place where it would not apply.
Kirsten?
As the runoff is probably not as well defined as discharges, it's, of course, it could be more challenging, but it's definitely relevant. But there are so many other things in this document that really needs revision. So maybe we should just leave also this one for the revision, because then we can get a more proper evaluation of it and proper definitions. I have a feeling that just putting it in now, which is fine for me in some aspects, still we are at risk of doing it a bit prematurely and not really knowing what we are doing. And it's so my suggestion would be to keep it on hold for the complete review of the SRS.
Would you keep would you keep the conflict or the apparent conflict between the heading and the wording in the body, or would you eliminate and run off in the heading as well?
There are so many other inconsistencies in this document, so no big issue for me, neither of them.
Okay, thank you. Stian?
I will keep it in the title, add it to the words and address it in the review. Runoff is not an easy measurement for companies. I mean, if you've got an operation of 400, 500 hectares, to determine the runoff is extremely difficult. So it's not going to be an easy disclosure to make and to verify. So my suggestion is keep it in there, add the words, but then follow up, with a detailed review of how it should be addressed and guidance around it.
So sorry, you're suggesting that where it mentions water discharges, keep it in the heading, and where it mentions water discharges in the body, add and runoff.
Correct.
Or runoff and or whichever one works out correctly.
Correct.
Judy, no. Okay, David.
I would just support Stian on that. It makes a sensible consistency, and then the details of how that's done can be addressed in the update.
Kirsten, I assume you would not be upset if that went that way? No. Okay. All right, any other views? Okay, so I think we agree to add runoff into the text, keep it in the heading, and we're there.
Yeah, let me bring this up because we have. Oops. We have a collective wordsmithing to confirm, which is the all-important and/or question, to make sure I've captured this correctly. So the revised text would say affected by water discharges or runoff, is that correct? And then we would have added in water discharges or runoff into the main body of the disclosure, and then on line 218 as well. Is that and? Should it be or? And? Or I'm getting two different.
It's and. There's a difference between discharges and runoff, so it should be and.
And, okay.
So can I just ask a question? Do we use or to mean and or, which some standard setters do? If we mean and or, do we write and or what's our rule on that?
We mean and or.
Because that's what this is. This is and or.
Yeah. Just to confirm, so currently it is an and or whenever we mean both variations of it, and it's not or in our case.
In which case, this is, am I correct? This should be and or, and slash or. Yeah.
Okay. Does the GSSB entrust the Secretariat to make these wording additions? So it will be and or throughout in those three cases. We're having trouble with the technical setup. Thank you.
Okay, a huge leap of trust there. The and/or. Whoa.
Devil in the detail.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so can I just take us back to the other two things that you mentioned, Lara? One was lines 181 through to 208, which you're saying they've just been carried over because they're somewhat problematic. It's going to be reviewed. Let's not do it. Let's not tinker. Can I ask a question on that? If by leaving it as it is, we haven't caused any inconsistency with other changes that we have made, have we? If we leave 181 to 208 as they were in G4, but we've changed some other things in the requirements, we haven't created an inconsistency that we didn't already have.
Yep, thanks. So for disclosure 5062, we have made a clarification. So we do have made some changes to the reporting requirement, and that should be consistent. However, for 5064, we haven't made any modifications. So the guidance section has some inconsistencies, but that does not affect the requirement necessarily.
Internal inconsistencies to the guidance itself. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Right. So do we have any views on either of those two, 5062 or 5064? People happy? Okay. All right, I think we can jump to the questions on 506. Is that correct? Yep. Okay, given the extent of questions and issues raised and the complexity of addressing them as part of this transition, 1, does the GSSB agree with holding off on major content revision for now and prioritising this standard for future review?
Yes.
Yes, everyone agrees. What specific modifications does the GSSB agree for this draft standard? And they're the ones that we've just discussed. So are we happy with the ones that we've entrusted to the Secretariat? Yes. And is the GSSB comfortable enough to approve the public exposure draft of this standard?
Yes.
Super. Okay. Firing on all 4. Thank you, everyone. That's excellent.
Yep.
So where to now, Chelsea?
So we now have the final category of standards to discuss, and these we've grouped together into one sort of discussion area because of the comments received from GSSB members. So these relate to the supplier environmental assessment and supplier social assessment and environmental compliance and socioeconomic compliance, and we wanted to discuss these in the context as well of talking about whether or not the current categories of social, environmental, and economic make sense going forward due to comments received from you guys about possibly restructuring these. So I will turn over to Lara to take us through an overview of some of the feedback received from you guys and what we foresee as being the options, but this promises to be a spirited debate based on your feedback already received.
Thank you. So as Chelsea mentioned, during the preliminary review of these standards, several GSSB members suggested merging the standards to reduce duplication and locating the new standards in the economic series. The standards division sees merit in merging the standards in order to reduce existing duplication, but we feel that the economic series is probably not the most logical fit conceptually for the new standards. So ahead of this meeting, we proposed 2 options for the GSSB to consider and to kickstart the discussion today. The preferred option of the standards division would be merging the standards to get rid of the duplication, but only if the existing categorization of economic, environmental, and social is removed. If removing this categorization is not seen as a viable option, the standards division would then recommend retaining these as separate standards under the environmental and social series. So these were the 2 options we posed to the GSSB, and we did get some initial reactions ahead of the meeting. And what we've seen is that the GSSB is divided on this issue. There's 3 members who would like to remove the categorization of economic, environmental, and social, but they have flagged that this will be a challenging decision to make, and that it requires substantive discussion among the GSSB. Even though they would agree to removing the categories, they do see value for users in having these distinctions. But in terms of making the structure future-proof, it might be better to get rid of the categorization, as in the future we might have more of these cross-cutting standards that currently don't have a home in the structure that we have developed. One member was in favor of retaining separate standards under the environmental and social series, and one rationale that was given is that, for example, in the supply chain area, both environmental and social issues might not always be material at the same time, and therefore there's merit in keeping them separate. Then the two members suggested alternative options, so a third and a fourth option. One suggestion was to add a fourth category for cross-cutting standards. So that would mean adding yet another series, 700. And another suggestion was to merge the supply chain standards only, but to keep the compliance standards separate. So for the purpose of the discussion now, I want to bring again the two initial options of the standards division to get the views of the full GSSB, and also invite any additional options you might see fit. One thing that the standards division can offer to do is to consult on this issue during the public comment that is currently underway, and to bring this feedback back to the GSSB, where a final decision can be taken later in the process.
Can I just ask a bit of clarity on that last point? You said, oh, I see, it went in the focus groups, etc. Yeah. Okay. So regardless of which way we go now, you will ask people what they think.
Yeah. And for this last comment, can I just remind the GSSB that we're going to be preaching to the converted during the public comment. So we're speaking to those that are familiar with the structure as it stands right now, which will bias the feedback. But in this discussion, it is also very important to look at the future-proof aspect of this discussion, and whether we can actually sustain a format that we're deciding now in future discussions, in particular with respect to this cross-cutting issues that seem to be endemic in our industry.
Okay, thanks, Laura and Bastian. Judy.
Yeah, I mean, Bastian's comment is exactly what's behind my kind of reaction to some of this. If it were just up to me personally, I look at this stuff all the time. I know exactly what's being proposed in lots of different standards. I would say let's get rid of the categorization, because we will just run into these problems of topics being multidimensional in one way or another. It's not up to me, and a little bit of very unscientific, just sort of conversations with friends and so forth have very much thrown up to me how ingrained these distinctions are. For most people who look at the GRI guidelines and soon-to-be standards, they will be expecting to see the distinctions between environmental, social, economic, because it's a way into it. It's a way of it not being a giant list of undifferentiated things. And therefore, it would very likely have at least a short-term effect that is negative and that we don't want. Whether that persists for a long time, whether that causes us to lose a part of our user audience, I don't really know. And that's why I would like to understand a little bit better about just what exactly, I mean, how significant beyond these four proposed standards that we're talking about right now, how significant is this problem? How pervasive is it across the different things that we can see right now in the GRI standards, never mind the things that we don't even know about in the future, because that we don't know about them by definition. So that if we went ahead and got rid of the categorization now, would we really be doing ourselves such a big favor in the future that it's worth I'm quite certain that there will be confusion and there will be disappointment if we get rid of the categorization among quite a lot of users right now. So I would urge caution on it, even though I think it's perfectly reasonable.
Okay, thanks. Kirsten?
I suppose I'm among those three. Suggestion to take away the distinctions. It was a conditioned recommendation based on exactly what Judy is saying, that short term, ideally, I would have preserved them. On the other hand, I see it can be pretty challenging to remove them later on. We have a very good possibility now to do it. If we're doing it later on, it's there's always something happening here, and then it would be regarded possibly as a big issue once more. So I'm not very firm in this recommendation, but still, I do see the arguments from the Standards Department, which I find very wise. At the same time, I hear from those I'm talking with that ESG is a very commonly used term, which is not completely in line with the GRI division, because we have E and we have S, and then we have E for environment, we have S for social, and then we have economic and standard disclosures for governance. But still, it is some division that people feel familiar with, and you will keep those divisions, won't you? It's things I frequently hear. That could, of course, be solved by showing some sort of a matrix when we do issue the new documents, showing what is what and what you can find where. That would probably help on it. I'm not sure if this was very clarifying, but at least it was some of the issues that I see related to it. And I strongly support merging the compliance documents and the supply chain standards.
Okay, thank you. Chelsea?
Yeah, just responding to Kirsten's point, I wonder if, I would say we do see quite a number of these, which could, and we had a discussion earlier about market presence, and, do these indicators, I think market presence actually sit in economic, or is this more social? There are a lot of these, even if the standards, if the current topic name can be categorized, some of the disclosures actually are more ambiguous. And I wonder, to your point, whether one way of doing this might be, if we came to the conclusion, if this group came to the conclusion that it's now is the right time to remove the categories, that actually all that we're really looking for is a Venn diagram or a poster that clearly organizes, regardless of how you number them. These ones are social issues, these ones are economic, these ones are cross-cutting, and that there we get the best of both worlds, and that we have one numbering sequence. We don't try and force the categorization, but for usability, actually there's a diagram we can update on an ongoing basis as these get revised or new topics are added, which tells people where to find different things. Just a thought for the group.
Thank you. Dwight?
My first reaction is I seem to recall this body having a very lengthy discussion about do we keep the three dimensions of sustainable development, and I recall that the conclusion was that we should, and I think that that's a good enough basis today to go with, in the sense that if we want to revisit that discussion, I would not object to it, but I don't see in the process of the transition to standards project to all of a sudden have a very brief revisit to a very long discussion and do this. And for that reason, I think it's, and also we have two other things that we need to keep in mind. One is that we're trying in the transition to standards process not to introduce too many big changes all at once, of which that would be a big change. The other, I tend to also be conservative on this issue because I, as you know, have expressed a lot of concern that sustainability is interpreted too many ways, and I want sustainability to be interpreted with the broader societal interest of sustainable development and not any other way. And so therefore, I'm very reluctant to get away from the Brundtland definition and this and that. As far as ESG goes, investors like that a lot, and I think one of the reasons they like it is the governance issues are very important to them, and I think a lot of investors feel that the financial aspects of their decisions are better covered not by the financial implications for society, but for the bottom line of the company. And so therefore that doesn't, the economic isn't quite as important to them. But I would prefer today to keep our three divisions and to therefore keep two standards at this point in time. The final point is on this cross-cutting idea. If we were to eventually decide a cross-cutting thing, I think we would have to talk about that a little more as to determine when something was genuinely cross-cutting. And in terms of the idea of the supply chain, I would be reluctant to do that at this point because I think how we got to the supply chain issue it wasn't a good first step. I think what we want to look at is not just the supply chain issues, but we want to look at the issues of the relationships enterprises have with each other that are not always going to be in a chain of production or something like that. I think I would prefer a more generic kind of expression. So for me today, I would go with the two standards and the minimum changes.
Thanks, Dwight. Nan Kuma.
Sorry. Thank you. I'll go by Dwight's suggestion that at this point we are making a transition, so we should not do away with the categorization. Doing away with the categorization will be a major change. We should not attempt that. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask a question of the Secretariat? In the first exposure that's gone out, we've announced our numbering system, etc., have we not? So it'd be a change from our first exposure.
Yes, so we have examples of each of the categories out for exposure, based on the discussion that Dwight was referring to. It is just that in the run-up to this meeting and the review of the 30 standards that you've been looking at, this has surfaced again, and that is the only reason that we are bringing this up, because there is sustained debate around this.
Okay. Saluma.
Thank you. Well, I'm not in favor to remove the categorization because of all it's being said, and we already had this discussion in the very early stage of this process. And I was thinking about materiality and in accordance criteria as it stands right now, and due to that, I'm not in favor to merge standards as it stands right now, because it's only the sentence it's here. It's because not all suppliers' operations are material in both environmental and social ways, and not all compliance material issues are related only with social and environmental issues at the same time. So, following our previous discussion for the past year, I'm not in favor to merge those standards.
Thank you. Stian?
Just a clarification for me. When you refer to merging the standards, is it merging all 4 standards into one, or is it merging the 2 supply chain into one and the 2 compliance into one?
It's the latter.
Okay. Then I'm in support of merging those 2, or the 4 into the 2, and we stay with the categorization as Dwight have said. That's my
So if we did that, where would those particular merged standards go? Would they go in environment or social?
I don't know.
Thank you. Okay. Judy, did you have another comment?
So just on, this is sort of in response to Chelsea's suggestion that we have, we get rid of the categorization formally, but we put out materials that will help to explain to users where to find things and what we think they refer to. And I'm all in favor of putting out all kinds of instructive and helpful tools for reporters to help them understand the standards much better. On the other hand, if what we're going to do is get rid of the categorization and then put out a kind of a poster that says, well, here are the ones we think are environmental, here are the ones we think are economic, here are the ones we think are social, what's the point of getting rid of the categorization? It sort of doesn't really do it for me. We either create a new, I don't like the language cross-cutting, I think it's sort of not the right term for me, but a new kind of multi-dimensional or something, we either create a new category or we just stick with what we have. I'd be happy with either of those. My sense from previous to this meeting and then the conversation that we're having right now is that we'd probably be best served in the short term by sticking with the categorization that we have, leaving open a broader conversation in the future about introducing a kind of multidimensional category to the extent that it's merited by future changes to the standards or by the kind of needs of the emerging needs of reporters, and not overly put up barriers to understanding or acceptance to the new standards.
Thank you. Hadimi.
I'm not so satisfied with the current categorization, especially in the economic part. It's really ambiguous. However, I think at this moment, at least, we should keep this categorization, and we should not change it. And especially for supply chain issues, still the many ESG rating agencies still separate environmental supply chain issues, social supply chain, it's clearly, most of the case. And also the operationally in a company, for example, sometimes it's not always the same. It's different types of supply chain management, environmental aspect and social type of stuff. So in this regard, I think we still keep this separation.
Thank you. David. Have you? Oh, I thought that was a residual. My apologies.
I really like the suggestion from Chelsea. I do understand Dwight's concerns, and I do remember the long discussions we had during the autumn on this issue. We also had long discussions on many other issues that have one by one been, they have fallen based on the good research and suggestions from the standards department. So that we did decide that at some point there can still be valid reasons for changing our minds, especially in a process that has been as complex as this one has. The most important reason why I'm supporting to take away the categories now is that this is really the time for doing it. Still, I do see the concerns. An alternative could also be that, well, we keep the categories as we have them now and put the merged compliance and the merged supply chain documents under economic, which is in many ways some sort of a cross-cutting category. Thank you.
David. Excuse me, David.
Thank you. I do a lot of assessment of market chains for organizations, and typically the metrics that I create are multidimensional. There are a few that are just purely fitting into environment, social or economic. But when you put those into a Venn diagram, you see that by and large, most of them fit into one of those categories by and large. So it's environment with a bit of social, or it's social with a bit of economic. And so by putting them in a Venn diagram, it helps my clients to understand where they fit, because it's typical human nature to want to divide things down into small chunks to understand them better. And I think if we were to get rid of environment, social and economic, two things would happen. One is we would confuse people, both on the reporting side and on people that read reports, and I don't think they would get rid of social, environment and economic. And so we wouldn't have achieved anything but confusing people. So there are a few circumstances where there is a balance of multidimensional, cross-cutting, whatever you want to call it, indicators that could say for those specific highly multidimensional ones, highly cross-cutting ones, you could put them into a fourth category. But other than that, I'm in favor of keeping the 3 dimensions of sustainability as they are, and using that to help people in their continuing understanding of this.
Thanks, David. Dwight?
When we combine these two, we don't create something new. I think we're combining two things that are separate, in the sense that we have tests of materiality, and that it's quite possible that an environmental and a social disclosure, one might be material and the other might not be material. And I don't think that we have in this electronic age any need to be concise. I mean, we can have a number of standards, since we have a well thought through materiality test as to whether you use it. And I think under the circumstances, I would prefer to see the two things in the two categories than to combine them to create yet another category at this day and age. I mean, now, maybe later on we can revisit this, but the activity where we had this discussion was precisely in this project. This earlier discussion was part of this transition to standards project, and I think we ought to carry on through and finish it.
Thanks, Dwight. Simeon?
First of all, on the merging of the 3 categories, I must admit it's not the perfect model, and I believe sometime down the line we will have to revisit this idea. I don't know what it would look like, but something has to be done about it, but not now, because one, I think we need another long discussion to really come up with something that we all agree with if we were to change. And secondly, it is really in conflict to our commitment for no major change, and I would really resist doing that. My second comment is exactly what Dwight said. In my experience, there are cases where we can claim immateriality to either social or the environmental category of a supplier assessment. To claim immateriality to half a standard is just plain weird, and I can't imagine how auditors or verifier how it's going to fly with the verification process. I think it's just going to create a lot of problems. And my last point is that if we were to merge those two, it looks similar because the wording is similar, but then we are creating a very large standard. And I think it's just very imbalanced to have standards that have so much in it and comparing to others. And I think that's not healthy to have that in our standards.
Okay, thanks, Simeon. Anyone else have a view they'd like to express? I think it seems clear to me, and correct me if I'm incorrect, that while there's some people who would like to see us change, there's a lot of nervousness about it, a lot of good reasons not to, as well as some good reasons to change, and that this is not the right time to make that change, and therefore that we should not get rid of our structure. Is that consensus? Okay. A separate question, I guess, is whether we could even, in some other way, consider merging these standards from 4 to 2, it might be a very quick discussion, I suspect, because if we're keeping the categories, and it can be material in one and not the other at various times, then I'd say we're probably not merging. But sorry, I shouldn't preempt. Judy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether this helps or not, but we could certainly put in some kind of a star or a symbol or whatever to sort of indicate that reporters may view these. There may be an extent to which we would recognize a kind of there might be a single management disclosure, you know, a management approach, you know, to multiple dimensions around compliance, for example. If we sort of leave that open somewhere, somehow, just a little bit of a footnote or a flag someplace, then maybe that kind of helps. On the other hand, it might just call attention to the fact that we've got two separate standards across the different dimensions, and people would be further drawn to think that's really strange. Why didn't they merge them? I think we're a bit damned if we do and damned if we don't, to be honest, on this.
Kirsten?
I also believe that could be a good, well, not the best alternative, but at least a better alternative than just having two different standards for the same topic, and that very many reporters would treat as one standard. We have treated it as one standard since, or as one topic since the G4 came, both for supply chain and for compliance. And from the limited number of reporting organizations I'm talking with, they feel very much the same. But just drawing the attention that this is, of course, possible would improve it a lot. For now, it looks like there are two different topics, and they are completely different, and then you look into them, and then it's exactly the same thing. So they wouldn't really become lengthy standards. By merging them, we would approximately half the total amount of words.
I'd look to the Secretariat for a view on that as to whether there's a scope for conserving words by some sort of recognising the overlap in some way.
No, not really. I think if the decision is to leave the categories untouched, then you would have to sustain two standards for both supply chain and compliance. There could be a reference to the duplication of contents in the two standards, so we would actually probably add a couple of words. But that's what it is, and there is not really. Otherwise, the only other option, and that there are standards where this exists, is that you have one standard and you basically give it then it's SRS 305 and SRS 408 in one, and then you can replace the words yourself. But so given the materiality principle and all of the discussion we just had, that doesn't seem to be a sensible solution for the issue we're looking at.
Thanks, Bastian. Salima?
I'm listening that there are overlap between environmental and social issues within supply chain, but actually there are separated items. So I was thinking about some features of supply chain, and in certain supply chains, the environmental issues will be material and the social ones will be not. So I'm not seeing this overlap between environmental and social issues on supply chain, and we should have two separated standards about it. I could live with the merging the compliance ones, because then we can tell that you do have labor legal issues or societal legal issues or environmental legal issues with no conflict between the themes. But regarding environmental and social issues on supply chains, we should keep it as separated SRS.
Okay. Is there scope to add the words that you mentioned, the extra couple of words, maybe in the background, or is it on the management approach? Is that where, no, you think it's more in the background, recognising there's commonality? Okay. We probably can't do that now, but yeah, okay. So where do we go? Are we approving anything here other than
These are the questions that we had for the group. So it sounds like the first one, does the GSSB agree with removing? You can take them through. Sounds like
Eric, do you
no.
want to do this?
Sure. Thank you. And just the record should show I've returned. So I appreciate the discussion I just heard. So going through the recommendations for this section, I believe what I just heard was that there was agreement for not removing the categorizations at this point, but recognize that there may be reason and good reason in the future. But at the risk of having relived the conversation we've previously had that got us to this point, so I don't want to relive it. So I think that's good. So I think that's helpful. Does the GSSB agree with merging 108, 620, 507, and 621? And I think the answer was no, if I caught the tail end of the discussion. I don't think anybody is objecting. Any other modifications? Did we have? Okay, go ahead.
There was a note that the Standards Division will add additional wording into the background context sections to clarify the overlap between these two pairs of standards and to explain that they can be reported together, if applicable.
Okay. Seems like appropriate modification to that. And so which specific? So is it all four of these? I'm sorry, I missed the early part. So it's all four of these standards that have been subject to this discussion? Yeah. Okay. And so at this point, unless there is some objection, I sense a consensus of the group with this modification on the background material that we will go ahead and prepare this for a public exposure draft. Seeing no objections. Okay. Done. Next.
That's it for today.
That's it for today. My goodness. Okay. I must have missed something while I was gone. Yeah, maybe I should leave more often. Seems. Yeah. Okay, so if that concludes our business, then it concludes our business. And so just for a preview of tomorrow for our session, we have obviously the agenda items, but we'll also have in that will be a review of the process, right, for these remaining standards and also the process for those that are currently out for review. Right? Okay. All right. Well, unless there's some other.
Do you just want to reiterate this?
Eric,
Well-
you had asked to have a list, just so
Yeah.
it goes on the record for the public meeting, that these specific drafts have all been approved for consultation. Up to you whether you still want to keep that, but that's the list here as part of the closing for today.
Well, that's what. So that's what we've done. Is to summarize, we've approved these. What are there? 12 of them? No, 12. For public comment, subject to the changes that we made in the course of the meeting that have been captured and identified by the Secretariat. So, Daniel.
Just a quick one on that. I think it's good to categorize there. Do we also disclose ones that we've put up for review as well? At what point do we how do we communicate what we've prioritized for review?
Well, so that'll be in terms of future work. Yeah, so that'll be part of our discussion with regard to the work plan and the development of our priorities, which we started that conversation at our last meeting. We'll have some continuation of that conversation. So what we've asked the Secretariat to do, or the Standards Division, is to capture our thoughts and their own thoughts based on the feedback that we've given as to what our initial prioritization will be, but we'll have a full discussion with all of those items lined up, and that it'll get interesting because we'll sort out which ones are the most important to each of us as individuals, and we'll need to come to a collective view on that. But yes, thank you for that. It will form the basis of our future work plan as we've prioritize which ones need to be worked on in what sequence on top of new work. So, okay. If there isn't anything else, then we'll close the meeting for today and re-adjourn at 9 tomorrow, 9 a.m. Amsterdam time. So thank you very much.